Video Part 3, Chapter 4, page 39. Like every guy that needed... Like every guy that read on the Reno by Kerouac, On the Road, gosh, what's wrong with me, by Kerouac, and wanted to cut loose and roam from coast to coast as he did without thinking of money or trouble or anything but the great freedom that awaited me like a ship heading to sea. I was looking for a change. I wanted to see something beyond high school and the King's Court and a grocery store aisle lined with canned vegetables. And I was especially itchy to feel new things, to shed my skin and grow. I couldn't explain myself to anyone because I was only full of excited urges and notions and desires, kind of like the Hulk before he transforms. Plus, I had a strong sense that I needed to snap off my past in order to have a future. All year, I had worked hard to keep myself together. That just makes me think of the whole question from the Anticipation Guide about can you run away from your problems? He wants to snap off his past so that he can have his future. Maybe sometimes you have to do that, but maybe that's the problem, is he let go of his past too quickly and he wasn't able to connect the dots to how that leads to his future problems. All year I had worked hard to keep myself together. I held my job, managed my own money, kept passing grades, and stayed out of deep trouble. But now my accomplishments just seemed like survival routines, and I wanted to move on to more romantic turf and to find out who I was and what might happen to me when the rubber met the road. And of course, I wanted to write. I figured if I crisscrossed Florida from coast to coast, as if I were tying up laces on a high top, a sneaker, I would eventually stumble on something juicy to write about. I was full of hope. I had been reading constantly. I kept up with my daily journal writing, logging my favorite quotes and building my vocabulary, and now it was time for me to stop being chippy high school writer and to challenge myself. So I began to shut down the Bad Attitude Clearinghouse. I gave away all of my thrift shop furnishings to whomever would take them. I gave my suit and jacket and striped shirts and club ties and wingtips to a young guy who was looking for work. I kept my t-shirts and jeans and sneakers. I rounded up the little kids and passed out all my candy stash, which they gleefully devoured. They didn't save one piece for later. And as I watched them prance and dance around the parking lot like sugared up puppets, I told myself to stop rationing pleasure as if it were a paycheck. It was time to cut loose and have fun and not worry about tomorrow. I wanted my candy too. So candy would be a symbolic element here, right? He doesn't really mean candy. He just wanted to have fun. Reading On the Road, I felt more like Sal Paradise than Dean Moriarty. Sal was in love with everything and everybody. His eyes were as wide open as his heart. He recorded what he saw and what he felt in equal amounts, as if he were balancing the great scales of observation and reflection. But Dean confused me. He just wanted to consume everything. He had to keep moving like a shark. And in the end, he was the tragic ghost of a person instead of a stream of Milky Way jazz under an open highway. I wanted to move like Dean, but I wanted Sal's heart and soul. Unlike Sal and Dean, I didn't have years to string out a trip. I had just over 2 weeks for a mini on-the-road adventure. I knew I was going to join my family in St. Croix. But first, I figured I'd drive up to Jacksonville, see Stephen Crane's house, then work my way down to the state of Key West and Hemingway's home. These are all authors, by the way. And finally, drive back to Miami to ship the car. That was all the structure I wanted. As Kerouac wrote, I was a young writer and I wanted to take off. Somewhere along the line, I knew there'd be girls, visions, everything. Somewhere along the line, the pearl would be handed to me. I wanted that pearl. There's another symbolism. I had spoken with my dad and told him I was putting off college and instead would help with his new company. I wasn't any good at construction, but I could drive the truck to pick up the crews and deliver supplies and work odd tasks in between. I told him I'd be home in a few weeks. He said he was counting on me, and it felt good to be needed by him. We could spend some time together after such a long break, and I could save money for college. That was a better fit for me. I called a shipping company and made a date to ferry my car to... One moment, please. St. Croix of Port Everglades. I booked an air ticket for myself and thought that helping my father, saving a few bucks, and writing on my own was all the purpose that I needed. Then, out of the blue, something happened that I hadn't planned on. My friend Tom Scanlon called. He wanted to visit. He graduated a year ahead of me and had been going to Florida State to study medicine on a full scholarship. He was a smart guy, and I knew him only because we had worked together at the grocery store. I didn't know any of his other friends, and he didn't know mine. The only reason why he wanted to stay with me is he didn't want his parents to know he was in town. He wanted to have some fun before he settled in with them for the summer. I told him he could hide out at my place for a few days, but then I was leaving. That was good enough for him. I picked Tim up at the train station. He had changed in for the last few years. His hair was down to his shoulders. He wore a pair of ripped jeans and a Hendrix t-shirt. He looked like he hadn't slept in a week, and by the time he got to my car, he had already lit a joint. Want some, he asked. I hesitated and started the engine. I'm in pre-med, he said. It can't hurt you. I took a puff, and then another, and after a few minutes, I fell silent. All my thoughts seemed big, very big, so endlessly big I couldn't get out of them. My brain hummed along as one thought segued into another. The concentration was incredible. If I had been reading a book, each page would have been the size of Kansas wheat field. The space inside my mind seemed endless. After a while, he tapped me on the shoulder. Good stuff, he remarked. I forgot I was driving. Did I run any lights? I asked in a panic. He grinned. I don't know, he replied, and shrugged. I wasn't paying attention. I'd already quit work, so we just lounged around my room for a few days. We were so high we hardly went out. The weed dazed us until we got hungry enough to drift down to the street to a pizza parlor where we ordered 2-for-1 large specials and burned sheets of skin off of our upper plates on the first bite. Then, with food in our bellies, we'd straighten up a bit and go back to the room and smoke a joint and settle down to talk up a storm. He liked my books. I guess you read a lot, he said, digging through the open boxes. You ever read Hallucinogens and Shamanism by Harner? Never heard of it, I replied. He's incredible, he said. He believes that hallucinogens are the way that we get in touch with our animal past. That is in our DNA is stored genetic memories of when we were evolving species. And when you take the stuff the Indians of Brazil take, you'll access your genetic library all the way back to cellular experience. All right, now if some dude was telling me this, that would be like my red flag to be like, you sound a little crazy, you look a little crazy, we're out. But this guy is looking for an adventure, so he kept him on. That seemed impressive to me. He talked about a lot of books I'd never heard of, scientific books on animal communication, studies on dancing bees by Carl von Fritz, reports on enzymes exchange communication between termites, and a book called Insect Societies by Edmund O. Wilson that linked human behavior to animals from apes to insects. All behavior is chemical, he said, getting so excited. He stood up and paced the room and beat his fist against his thighs. I pegged him as Dean Moriarty and was happy he showed up with his wild genetic ideas. Your memory is just chemistry, your motivations, your everything. You have to read the stuff I read, he insisted. He wrote out a frenzied list, and with each title he let out a hiss of excitement, pushed the hair out of his eyes, and pronounced each book better than the last. This stuff on our biocommunication is the future, he said. It will take you back to the why of everything. Remember when you were a little kid and kept asking why and your parents gave you some half-baked answer? Well, these books get down to the root of the why. If you understand this stuff, you will understand everything. Religion, politics, psychology, art, the history of human desire is entirely in our chemistry. He knew great stuff about biology and chemistry and medicine. I knew something about literature and what people plotted in their hearts and thought and suspected. But he knew the secret of why behind each thought. I only knew how it looked once it happened. Once it went splat in my face, and suddenly I wanted to know the why of everything. It seemed the most important desire I'd ever known. You have to read more science, man, he encouraged. It's opening doors on behavior. I mean, literature is good, but the literature of the future is going to be based on genetics, not on the environment. Believe me, the stuff we're learning is heavy. Right away, I was disappointed that I wasn't going to college. I had always believed in the maxim that the best way to predict the future was to create it. That's quite an important quote, I think. The best way to predict the future is to create it. Now, is that true or not? And is that going to be true for Jack Gantos? Now the future appeared inaccessible to me. Without science, I was just another stimulus response cave dweller howling at the moon. I got lousy grades, I said, feeling as if I had already wasted my entire life. Don't sweat it, he sneered. You could go to any college in the world. You got more than grades, you got brains. But no money, I concluded, which is actually worse than being an idiot. Well, I can help you there, he started. Let's sell some weed and make some cash. He ran his hands through his long blonde hair. We'll drive up to Tallahassee and cop from the guys in the lab there. They grow the most potent stuff, hydroponically. None of the throat-burning yard twigs you cop from the hippies which make you jumpy. The lab stuff is mind-blowing, better than Thai stick. Yeah, I said. I was totally caught up in his vision. He knew things I had never considered, had never heard of. He was on a roll, and I was ready to roll with him. Let's hit the road, I said. It took me about a minute to load my car. I trotted over to Davy's place and turned in my key and gave her a big hug and a gift I'd been saving for just this moment. She peeled off the wrapping paper. It was a signed photo of Fess Parker, who had played Davy Crockett on the TV show I had found in a thrift store. I love it, she hooted. You always have a place here, so keep in touch. As much as I loved Davies, I left the King's Court feeling some vague relief that my high school years in a motel was over. But before I could consider what the relief meant, I was swallowed up by the excitement of the adventure. I drove directly to the grocery store and cashed a check for $300, which was half of my savings. I gave Tim $200 for the score. Now that's not even smart finances there, sir. Not smart finances at all. By the time we got up to Tallahassee, it was dark. We checked in the motel, and he made a few calls. We're in luck, he said, setting down the receiver. They'd just dried a fresh cop and plucked off the buds. I drove him over to the school lab and dropped him off. He had a student idea and could hang out there until the dope was ready. I went back to the motel room to wait for his call. 4 hours later, I was still waiting. I began to think that something was wrong. Maybe he wasn't coming back. Maybe he got arrested. Maybe he had ripped me off. I watched TV until I fell asleep, and at sunrise, I tried to drive onto the campus, but without a student ID, I was stopped by security at the front gate. I returned to the motel and waited in my room until checkout time. Then I went down to the lobby and sat there all day trying to read the newspaper, but every time the phone rang, which was every few minutes, my head jerked toward the clerk, who was sympathetic enough to shake his head no with each call. At dusk, I told myself I would leave at sundown. At sundown, I told myself I'd give it just a little more time. I left at 9 when it was pitch black out. I did the best I could to rub him and the rip-off out of my mind by returning to the original plan. I got in my car and kicked my butt straight across the state of Jacksonville. In the morning, I found where Stephen Crane had lived and sat in the front in the house reading The Red Badge of Courage. Now, how stupid was he? He gave his friend almost like a quarter of his savings all on this like plan, and then his friend just like took off and never got back at him. Or will he? But like, who just gives somebody money and lets them go, right? So He's smart, but is he street smart? Maybe not. So he read The Red Badge of Courage, which was so good that I couldn't figure out why I hadn't read it earlier. Henry Fleming's convictions impressed me. His desire to fight, his fear of being a coward, his renewed vow of courage. Suddenly, I felt incredibly lucky, like Henry. I sensed I was enlisting in something great too, writing, and that it was time for me to stop running away from it, but to face it head on.